Today, we continue our story of the Yippie Invasion of Disneyland, one of the most infamous stories in the history of the park. A story of two groups, young activists who object to the war in Vietnam and to corporate greed, and two older residents of Anaheim and managers of Disneyland who were attempting to continue the cultural tones of the 1950s and 1960s, an era that had deeply benefited America as a country and had financially benefited most families. This same group also sought to maintain order in public areas pertaining to the park while not overtly limiting the freedom of individuals. Among these people was Dick Nunis, who sought to continue the ideals he had learned from Walt himself. Last time, we mostly focused on the Yippies and their objectives as they zeroed in on Disneyland. And in this installment, we'll mainly focus on Disneyland managers and law enforcement as they feared a gathering arranged for the park might explode into a political riot. So, if you have your cruise control set, if you have your walking shoes all laced up, if your earbuds are already paired to your phone, let's move into today's episode and get things going. Among early Disneyland managers, perhaps the most important was Dick Nunis. Though he started as an assistant to Van France in 1955, educating new hires about the service-oriented culture of Disneyland, he quickly rose to become an area supervisor in Adventureland and Frontierland. During those years, he shadowed Walt through the park trying to understand how the older visionary viewed his creation. More so than other managers, Nunis sought to organize how Walt wanted his park to be managed into a series of codes and rules, specifically how Walt wanted his attractions presented and how the Disneyland experience was conveyed to guests through the appearance and courtesy of cast members and through the cleanliness of the park. In the early 1960s, Nunis accompanied Walt Disney as they escorted a guest, the Reverend Billy Graham, through Adventureland. When they got off the Jungle Cruise, Graham said, "Walt, what a marvelous world of fantasy you've created." Walt looked at the evangelist, his eyes lifted with interest. "Take a look around you," he said. "Look at all the people representing all nationalities, all colors, all languages, and they're all smiling, all having fun together. Billy, this is the real world. The fantasy is outside." Nunis understood Walt's point immediately. For Walt, the park wasn't a simple diversion. It was, in ways, the beginning of a model society, something that later might be arranged into the city of Epcot that Walt wanted to build in Florida. The idea was simple. Remove people from their home environments, mix them together in a park where no one has class or financial advantage. That is, everyone waits in the same lines, and you can create a type of equality. In the years after Walt's passing, Nunis related the story to new Disneyland hires as, for him, it embodied the essence of what Walt was trying to accomplish in the park. It was, in ways, a social experiment integrated into an amusement park. Immediately following Walt's death, Nunis understood that his role was to continue Walt's ideas at his park, even as America quickly moved away from the world that Walt had known. At times, Nunis and others who hoped to further Walt's ideals could only guess as to how Walt himself might have reacted to the anti-corporate, anti-government activism that burned across the country during the height of the Vietnam War. In the summer of 1970, as Yippie tensions developed, Nunis planned to relate this story one more time. That Disneyland was designed in part to bring people together from different backgrounds. Though it was owned by a large American company, it was arranged to imbue a type of equality to all who visited. One morning, before front gates opened, recently hired cast members gathered into the Fantasyland Theater for a midsummer program. During the operating day, this 450-seat theater presented the half-hour animated short cartoon Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day to guests, but before the park opened, It was one of the few places where management could address large groups of cast members. Nunes, then the director of operations, understood that these new hires, many of them college students on summer break, were different from those of previous generations. They were more focused on community issues and social justice. When he took the stage, he worked to connect with them. He was now 38 years old, nearly twice the age of most people in the audience. He was dressed in a white shirt and tie, which defined his role as management, a role that was now viewed with skepticism by college students. He explained that Disneyland regularly reached out to charity organizations to bring less fortunate children into the park at no cost as a way of making the world we all live in a better place. Each month, they also invited Vietnam vets to experience Disneyland and to have lunch at the Plaza Inn. In a moment of quiet reflection, he related a recent story in which he greeted veterans who had been injured in the war. For some amputees, he was honored to shake the prosthetic hooks that had replaced their hands. Looking out at the crowd, he said he still understood what it was like to be young. The typical Disneyland employee, he said, works all day and drinks wine all night. All we ask is you get enough sleep so you can see the guests. When the room quieted, he started in on the story of Billy Graham, explaining that Disneyland was a place that inspired equality. Rich and poor, people from different ethnic backgrounds, even different political backgrounds, standing side by side, blending into a type of brief community. In previous years, this had been the moment when new cast members saw that Disneyland might be something larger than a mere amusement park. On this day, though, in the summer of 1970, there were some who could see into this larger vision, how the pleasure of entertainment could lift people into their better selves and create a temporary community. But there were some who could not accept this message and viewed it as another piece of corporate manipulation. Among those who saw Disneyland as nothing more than a summer job was Steve Silverman, a new employee, also a student at Cal State San Bernardino, who claimed that for him the Magic Kingdom had already, quote, lost its spell. Silverman wasn't alone. In the audience with him were other young people who questioned the expense of a Disneyland vacation, who disagreed with the company's plans to build a new ski resort in the environmental wonderland of the Sierras, who felt the Disney look for employees was tied to a previous era, a set of haircuts that made teenagers look like their parents. Nunes concluded the presentation by looking out at the audience and with a practiced excitement saying, "And remember, we're the only organization headed by a mouse." By the middle of July, both Disneyland managers and the Anaheim Police Department understood that the Yippie Powwow represented a potential threat to the park, though neither understood how to evaluate nor to strategize against it. In part, the college-oriented anti-war movement was effective in dispersing information so that it bypassed police detection. Flyers were distributed by hand, messages were broadcast on underground FM radio, information was placed in alt weeklies, using ornate language that could easily be interpreted as comic overstatement. By July 19th, the CIA was aware of the possible gathering. A memo included in their files noted that Disneyland would be the target of, quote, hippie action. It further explained that hippies planned to, quote, take over Disneyland and do their thing. Field Lieutenant Harold Bastrop of the Anaheim Police Department was put in charge of developing a response plan. He met with Disney managers and security officers. He also met with the Anaheim DA's office, as well as the Sheriff's Department and the Highway Patrol. His strategy was almost surely informed by recent anti-war protests in the state, such as the recent bank burning in Santa Barbara. his plan would establish a backstage command post at Disneyland, which would be up and running by the morning of August 6th. Disneyland security would handle any minor violations inside the park, specifically pertaining to park rules and minor transgressions such as petty theft. Officers, arranged into squads, would only move into the park after consultation with Disneyland management. Representatives of the DA's office would be on site to facilitate arrest charges against offenders. The sheriff's office would provide buses to be used as holding bins for those arrested. In case of fire, particularly trash can fires, as had happened in Santa Barbara, one additional city fire truck would be placed backstage. Beyond this, additional riot-trained officers would be housed at the Anaheim Convention Center to provide backup. Lastly, undercover officers dressed in wigs and hippie clothes would mix in with guests in the park to monitor the situation on the ground, under the assumption that no one would notice that a supposed yippie was actually a 35-year-old man with a wig. This plan also defined a line of command. Disneyland, as a private business, would maintain its own security and control of its property, processing minor offenses as it did on most business days. However, if police squads were moved from backstage into guest areas, the control of the situation would then be assumed by the Anaheim Police Department. If this happened, it would be the first time that the Disney organization was not officially in control of the park. Quote, "Relying on law enforcement was Plan B," Dick Nunes explained. "I had confidence in our supervisors and security cast members." The goal from Nunes' perspective was to keep all officers backstage as a preventative measure and hope that Disney security would be able to handle any disturbances in the park. Photos of armed officers in Disneyland might be a public relations nightmare and would certainly damage the movie-like wonder that Walt had artfully organized into his park. By the first week of August, Anaheim police were in regular communication with departments in other cities, hoping to understand the Yippie powwow as it developed. In Tucson, Arizona, officers received alerts informing them of, quote, "rumors of a national Yippie Day at Disneyland." Police were urged to look for any, quote, hippie or yippie movement headed westward, and then report that movement to Anaheim so that local officers might better understand the scope of the gathering. Another report, distributed among law enforcement officials in Prima, Arizona, further elevated concern. Quote, "Our intelligence indicates a good possibility of a major confrontation," the report advised, "and that some of the subjects may be armed with firearms and explosives. Use caution on all shakedowns." In Anaheim, police specifically worried that the Yippie powwow might escalate into a significant problem where visitors, peaceful at first, were spurred toward a conflict by some speech or other event that happened in the park. In other words, they were worried that the event might grow into a riot similar to the one that had engulfed the university community in Santa Barbara earlier in the year, when protesters had burned down a bank. But even as Anaheim police worked to spread warnings about the Yippie powwow to other departments, Disneyland managers sought to keep the story out of Southland papers, explaining that such reports would only exacerbate the problem, enticing more Yippies to come to Anaheim, and might even encourage other political activists to arrange additional rallies at the park later in the year. In return for their relative silence, Disneyland promised reporters that they would have fair access to the park if an issue actually developed. As Jack Lindquist recalled, all the local papers complied except one. On August 4th, quote, "A Fullerton paper, however, broke the story," he said, "ahead of time by reporting that we anticipated a problem in 2 days." During the days leading up to the Yippie powwow, according to the city of Anaheim, the, quote, "police department and Orange County police agencies began training their officers in crowd control." The training involved not only crowd control measures, but also the use of riot gear and tactical formations. Disneyland officials also increased security, believing that the park might see activist-related problems before the powwow itself. One cast member recalled that security regularly swept the park with an eye toward suspicious items. He also recalled that security found a small smoke bomb. Though such a device would be more of a nuisance than a danger, this event, if true, likely increased anxiety within Disneyland management. For a while, park management considered closing Disneyland on August 6th as a preventative measure. Quote, Disneyland Vice President Cardwalker originally wanted to close the park for the day, Dick Nunes explained, but executives also understood that doing so might lead to more political acts directed at Disneyland, as they might now appear to be an easy target to manipulate. Though Nunes himself wanted to keep the park open, he believed that the issue was so significant that he didn't want to make the final decision himself. Instead, he reviewed the situation with Roy O. Disney, the 77-year-old president of Walt Disney Productions. Quote, Roy Disney made the decision to let us open, Nunes recalled. Then Roy said, okay, we'll go along with your plan. With this, Roy also indicated that despite his age, he wanted to be at the property, if not in the park, as events unfolded to help preserve the Disney image. As the LA Free Press learned that multiple police departments in Orange County were preparing contingency plans for large-scale activity, they warned their readers to be prepared for the worst. Quote, local police and sheriffs are undergoing heavy riot training for the Yippie Invasion of Disneyland, they said. Further, they could be armed heavily with orders to do it, so consider yourself forewarned. On the day before the Yippie powwow, according to entertainment manager Ben Harris, quote, everybody at the park was called into a meeting about what was going on. They gave an assignment to every person in an office, to secretaries, to management people. Every restroom would have a man or woman assigned in front of it to be there, to go in periodically and check. To those gathered, Nunes explained management's concern as they presently understood it. Quote, what the activists were trying to do with the Yippie movement was frankly trying to use Orange County as a focal point to try and really create a lot of notoriety and publicity. A spokesperson for the Anaheim Police Department, Ken Clements, later explained that officers were concerned about the park because, quote, those underground idiot sheets advised it, suggesting attendance, quote, would be close to 80,000 Yippies. But Field Lieutenant Bastrop, who managed the response plan, understood that the situation was far more fluid. They weren't seeing a typical youth migration, as reported by other departments, that would have signaled a massive event in Orange County. Though newspapers were reporting 50,000 to 100,000 people would come together at Disneyland, quote, the police department's intelligence did not confirm these numbers, and so we expected a much smaller group. Outside of official channels, members of the youth underground were quietly pleased at the confusion and anxiety caused by their campaign. One would later note, quote, Disney officials and local authorities were freaked out. Their estimate ranged from 20,000 to 200,000 Yippies who might converge on their happiest place on earth. For the most part, the Yippie activists controlled both the message and the medium of delivery, both of which bewildered adult managers at Disneyland and those in the police department. Because they didn't know how to effectively decipher the message or even understand the full method of communication, they assumed the worst. On the evening of August 5th, the Anaheim Police Department began to arrange a mobile command center at Disneyland, believing that a large-scale riot might possibly erupt the following day. When reporters asked Yippies why they chose Disneyland, they said, quote, it's a middle-class bastion. And it's a plastic depiction of the American dream that's phony. On the night of August 5th, a Wednesday, Disneyland was open late, as local police were setting up a substation backstage behind Main Street. In the park, thousands of guests were enjoying the rides, restaurants, and the fireworks. Over in Tomorrowland, roughly where Space Mountain now stands, was an outdoor stage completed 3 years earlier. But that summer, as part of Disneyland's 15th anniversary, the park staged a musical review of American standards called Show Me America. The show had been created by Bob Yanni, the same creative director who a few weeks earlier had developed the Honor America Spectacular in Washington, D.C. Show Me America, in terms of its tone and presentation, was both similar to and different than the show Yanni had orchestrated in D.C. First off, though the staging of Honor America at the nation's capital had featured primarily white entertainers, the show at Disneyland, like many musical presentations there, featured performers from a range of racial backgrounds. But similar to Honor America, the tone of the Disneyland show, or at least segments of the show, was exuberantly patriotic both in music, dance, and costume. Some songs that were featured were simply standards, such as Give My Regards to Broadway, but others were tomes with a political message, such as Yankee Doodle Dandy and You're a Grand Old Flag. For most Yippies, it was impossible to be supportive of a country that participated in events such as the war in Vietnam that they found intolerable. That night, guests watched this show presented on the Tomorrowland stage at 9 p.m. and 11 p.m., a wild, expansive 30-minute musical. They rode the Matterhorn and It's a Small World. They had dinner at the Plaza Inn and the Blue Bayou. Slowly in groups, as the hour neared the 1 a.m. closing time, they left the park, heading back to their cars or walking to one of the many hotels located just outside the park. The final sweep through Disneyland, checking to make sure it was empty, would have occurred around 2 a.m., 1 hour after closing. At that time, the last of the regular cast members went home, leaving the park to janitorial and maintenance, while in the parking lot, backstage areas, and across the street at the Anaheim Convention Center, officers continued to develop various stations to house officers, organize leadership, and hold those arrested, assuming that problems did actually develop at the park the following day. I'll be back on Sunday to lay down the third part of this story, when tensions begin to unfold between Disneyland managers, law officers, and Yippie's intent on creating a political statement. It is one of the most explosive stories that has ever occurred inside of a Disney park. If you enjoy these episodes, you can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, as well as the audio guide to Disney World that we're presently developing. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.